Okay, to take up where I left off with the first of this series, and now I have it a little better. Maybe it can be readable. I know that first one wasn't, but I've got the print a little bigger this time. And I will read a portion of what was at the last of the last reading. We had something to eat while we talked about the new book. I read Jane the title for it several times. She didn't seem to be very taken with it. I don't know whether I'm going on with the session or not, she finally said. I'm just waiting. So far I haven't gotten anything. Resume eventually at 11:25 with many pauses. And this is Seth again. Dying is a biological necessity, not only for the individual, but to ensure the continued vitality of the species. Dying is a spiritual and a psychological necessity, for after a while, the exuberant, ever-renewed energies of the spirit can no longer be translated into flesh. Inherently, each individual knows that he or she must die physically in order to survive spiritually and psychically, underlined. The self outgrows the flesh. Particularly since Darwin's theories, the acceptance of the fact of death has come to imply a certain kind of weakness. For it is not said that only the strong. For is it not said that only the strong survive? To some degree, epidemics and recognized illnesses serve the sociological purpose of providing an acceptable reason for death, a face-saving device for those who have already decided to die. This does not mean that such individuals make a conscious decision to die, in your terms, but such decisions are often semi-conscious. It might be that those individuals feel they have fulfilled their purposes, but such decisions may also be built upon a different kind of desire for survival than those understood in Darwinian terms. It is not understood that before life an individual decides to live. A self is not simply the accidental personification of the body's biological mechanism. Each person born desires to be born. He dies when that desire no longer operates. No epidemic or illness or natural disaster or stray bullet from a murderous gun will kill a person who does not want to die. The desire for life has been more flaunted, yet human psychology has seldom dealt with the quite active desire for death. In its natural form, this is not a morbid, frightened, neurotic, or cowardly attempt to escape life, but a definite, positive, healthy acceleration of the desire for survival, in which the individual strongly wants to leave physical life at once, as once the child wanted to leave the parent's home. I am not speaking here of the desire for suicide, which involves a definite killing of the body by self-deliberate means, often of a violent nature. Ideally, this desire for death, however, would simply involve the slowing of the body's processes, the gradual disengagement of psyche from flesh, or in other instances, according to individual characteristics, a sudden, natural stopping of the body's processes. Left alone, the self and the body are so entwined that the separation would be smooth. The body would automatically follow the wishes of the inner self. In the case of suicide, for example, the self, to some extent, acting out of context with the body, which still has its own will to live. I will have more to say about suicide, but I do not mean here to imply guilt on the part of a person who takes his or her life. In many cases, a more natural death would have ensued in any event as a result of diseases, period. Often, for example, a person wanting to die originally intended to experience only a portion of Earth's life, say childhood. This purpose would be entwined with the parent's intent. Such a son or daughter might be born, for instance, through a woman who wanted to experience childbirth but who did not necessarily want to encounter the years of child raising for her own reasons. The telephone began to ring. The sudden noise was a shock so deep. The telephone began to ring. The sudden noise was a shock, so deep was our mutual concentration, yet Jane didn't come out of trance. As Seth, she stared at me. I stared back, making no effort to take the call. Fortunately, the ringing soon stopped. Such a mother would attract a consciousness who desires, perhaps, to re-experience childhood but not adulthood, or who might teach the mother lessons sorely needed. Such a child might naturally die at 10 or 12 or earlier, yet the ministrations of science might keep the child alive far longer, until such a person begins encountering an adulthood thrust upon him or her, so to speak. An automobile accident, suicide, or another kind of accident might result. The person might fall prey to an epidemic, but the smoothness of biological motion or psychological motion has been lost. I'm not here condoning suicide, for too often in your society it is the unfortunate result of conflicting beliefs. And yet it is true to say that all deaths are suicide, and all births deliberate on the part of child and parent. To that extent, you cannot separate issues like a population explosion on the part of certain portions of the world from epidemics, earthquakes, and other disasters. In wars, people automatically reproduce their kind to make up for those that are killed, and when the race overproduces, there will be automatic controls set upon the population. Yet these will in all ways fit the intents and purposes of the individuals involved. End of dictation, end of session. My heartiest regards. After giving a few lines of material for herself, Jane abruptly came out of a very deep trance without saying good night as Seth. I haven't any memory of anything since break, she said. We were tired. I don't know yet how I'll go about producing my part of mass events, of course, but the reader, picking up the finished work, will be able to tell at a glance all the decisions I made, whether the session notes are long or short, numerous or scarce, how often I referred to the other Seth books, and whether or not I added any appendix material. Well, I told Jane as we went to bed, right now my idea is that we'll have only short notes and no appendixes. Doing things that way will speed up the publication date. I'm all too conscious of the great amount of physical time I'm spending on the 2 volumes of Unknown Reality. Often feel responsible for holding up publication of Volume 2, especially since Seth finished dictating it almost exactly 2 years ago. Session 801 notes. Number 1. In the order of their publication, the 5 previous Seth books are Seth Speaks, The Eternal Validity of the Soul, The Nature of Personal Reality, a Seth book, Volumes 1 and 2, of the Unknown Reality, a Seth book, and The Nature of the Psyche, Its Human Expression. All of Jane's books, whether produced with or without Seth, are listed in the front matter of mass events with publication dates. I don't mean to confuse the reader by using the titles of Seth's old books, but rather to show how Jane's and my work encompasses a number of projects at once. That is, we have yet to manage to work on just one book of any kind at a time. That would be too simple. There's always a long, slow rate of turnover in our labors, it seems. As one book or project is finished, another rises almost effortlessly to take its place, and everything rolls along together until the next large change comes about. That progression in Jane's endeavors, and in my own to a lesser degree, may reflect her strong writing and psychic abilities, but it also reveals the way we constantly work with her work, and how we go about presenting it in the form of physical books, so that we can show others what we've been up to. Note that even though Seth finished dictating Volume 1 of Unknown Reality almost 3 years ago, and I completed my own notes and appendixes for 6 months ago, We've just now coming to the end of the long, complicated process involved in following the manuscript through the editorial and production stages. I think I'm going to skip on because this is not interesting, this part of how they're doing their books. I'm going to skip on to, because there's quite a lot of that, talking about how he's working on these different books. So I'm trying to see where I can get back to what Seth has to say. Okay, here we are. Dictation. Now, to a certain extent, epidemics are the result of a mass suicide phenomena on the parts of those involved. Biological, sociological, or even economic factors may be involved, in that for a variety of reasons and at different levels, whole groups of individuals want to die at any given time, but in such a way that their individual deaths amount to a mass statement. On one level, the deaths are a protest against the time in which they occur. Those involved have private reasons, however. The reasons, of course, vary from one individual to another, yet all involved want their death to serve a purpose beyond private concerns. Partially, then, such deaths are meant to make the survivors question the conditions, for unconsciously the species well knows there are reasons for such mass deaths that go beyond accepted beliefs. In some historical periods, the plight of the poor was so horrible, so unendurable, that outbreaks of the plague occurred, literally resulting in a complete destruction of large areas of the environment in which such social, political, and economic conditions existed. Those plagues took rich and poor alike, however, so the complacent well-to-do could see quite clearly, for example, that to some extent sanitary conditions, privacy, peace of mind had to be granted to the poor alike, for the results of their dissatisfaction would have quite practical results. Those were deaths of protest. Individually, each victim was to one extent or another a victim of apathy, despair, or hopelessness, which automatically lowered bodily defenses. Not only do such states of mind lower the defenses, however, but they activate and change the body's chemistries after its balances and alter its balances and initiate disease conditions. I'll read that again. I kind of messed that sentence up. Not only do such states of mind lower the defenses, however, but they activate and change the body's chemistries, alter its balances, and initiate disease conditions. Many viruses inherently capable of causing death in normal conditions contribute to the overall health of the body, existing side by side, as it were, with other viruses, each contributing quite necessary activities that maintain body equilibrium. If certain viruses are triggered, however, to higher activity or overproduction by mental states, they then become deadly. Physically, they may be passed on in whatever manner is peculiar to a specific strain. Literally, individual mental problems of sufficient severity emerge as social mass diseases. The environment in which an outbreak occurs points at the political, sociological, and the economic conditions that have evolved, causing such disorder. Often such outbreaks take place after ineffective political or social action, that is, after some unified mass social protest has failed or is considered hopeless. They often occur also in wartime on the part of a populace that is against a given war in which its country is involved. Initially, there is a psychic contagion. Despair moves faster than a mosquito or an outward carrier of a given disease. The mental state brings about the activation of a virus that is, in those terms, passive. Despair may seem passive only because it feels that exterior action is hopeless, but its fires rage inwardly, and that kind of contagion can leap from bed to bed and from heart to heart. It touches those, however, who are in the same state only, and to some extent it brings about an acceleration in which something can indeed be done in terms of group action. Now, if you believe in one life only, then such conditions will seem most disastrous, and in your terms they clearly are not pretty. Yet, though each victim in an epidemic may die his or her own death, that death becomes part of a mass social protest. The lives of intimate survivors are shaken, and according to the extent of the epidemic, the various elements of social life itself are disturbed, altered, rearranged. Sometimes such epidemics are eventually responsible for the overthrow of governments, the loss of wars. There are also even deeper biological connections with the heart of nature. You are biological creatures. Your proud human consciousness rests on the vast, unconscious integrity of your physical being. In that regard, your consciousness is as natural as your toe. In terms of the species' integrity, your mental states are then highly important. Despair or apathy is a biological enemy. Social conditions, political states, economic policies, and even religious or philosophical frameworks that foster such mental states bring about a biological retaliation. They act like fire applied to a plant. The epidemics then served many purposes, warning that certain conditions will not be tolerated. There is a biological outrage that will be continually expressed until the conditions are changed. Give us a moment. Even in the days of the great plagues in England, there were those smitten who did not die, and there were those untouched by the disease who dealt with the sick and dying. Those survivors who were actively involved saw themselves in a completely different light than those who succumbed, however. They were those untouched by despair, who saw themselves as effective rather than ineffective. Often they roused themselves from lives of previously unheroic situations, and then performed with great bravery. The horror of the conditions overwhelmed them where earlier they were not involved. The sight of the dying gave them visions of the meaning of life and stirred new ideas of sociological, political, and spiritual natures, so that in your terms the dead did not die in vain. Epidemics, by their public nature, speak of public problems that sociologically threaten to sweep the individual to psychic disaster as the physical materialization does biologically. These are the reasons also for the range of the limits of various epidemics, why they sweep through one area and leave another clear, why one in the family will die and another survive. For in this mass venture the individual still forms his or her private reality. Give us a moment. In your society, scientific medical beliefs operate, and a kind of preventative medicine mentioned earlier, in which procedures of inoculation are taken, bringing about in healthy individuals a minute disease condition that then gives immunity against a more massive visitation. In the case of any given disease, this procedure might work quite well for those who believe in it. It is, however, the belief and not the procedure that works. I am not recommending that you abandon the procedure when it obviously works for so many, yet you should understand why it brings about the desired results. Such medical technology is highly specific, however. You cannot be inoculated with the desire to live, or with the zest, delight, or contentment of the healthy animal. If you have decided to die, protected from one disease in such a manner, you will promptly come down with another or have an accident. The immunization, while specifically effective, may only reinforce prior beliefs about the body's ineffectiveness. It may appear that left alone the body would surely develop whatever disease might be fashionable at the time, so that the specific victory might result in the ultimate defeat as far as your beliefs are concerned. You have your own medical systems, however. I do not mean to undermine them, since they are undermining themselves. Some of my statements clearly cannot be proven in your terms and appear almost sacrilegious. Yet, throughout your history, no man or woman has died who did not want to die, regardless of the state of medical technology. Specific diseases have certain symbolic meanings, varying with the times and places. Give us a moment. Are your hands tired? Rob says no. There has been great discussion in past years about the survival of the fittest in Darwinian terms, but little emphasis is placed upon the quality of life or of survival itself, or in human terms there has been little probing into the question of what makes life worthwhile. Quite simply, if life is not worthwhile, no species will have a reason to continue. Civilizations are literally social species. They die when they see no reason to live, yet they seed other civilizations. Your private mental states, en masse, bring about the mass cultural stance of your civilization. To some extent, then, the survival of your civilization is quite literally dependent upon the condition of each individual, and that condition is initially a spiritual, psychic state that gives birth to the physical organism. That organism is intimately connected to the natural biological state of each other person and to each other living thing or entity, however minute. Despite all realistic, pragmatic tales to the contrary, the natural state of life itself is one of joy, acquiescence with itself, a state in which action is effective and the power to act is a natural right. You would see this quite clearly with plants, animals, and all other life if you were not so blinded by beliefs to the contrary. You would feel it in the activity of your bodies, in which the vital individual affirmation of your cells brings about the mass, immensely complicated achievement of your physical being. That activity naturally promotes health and vitality. I am not speaking of some romanticized, passive, floppy spiritual world, but of a clear reality without impediments, in which the opposite of despair and apathy reigns. This book will be devoted then to those conditions that best promote spiritual, psychic, and physical zest, the biological and the psychic components that make a species desire to continue its kind. Such aspects promote the cooperation of all kinds of life on all levels with one another. No species competes with another, but cooperates to form an environment in which all kinds can creatively exist. End of dictation. We will have a rip-roaring book this time. You may end the session or take a break as you prefer. We'll take the break. Jane's delivery had been quite intent throughout, even though she'd taken many pauses. Some of them had been long. Before the session, she had wondered if she really wanted to have one, but as on other such occasions, she came through with excellent material once she started. Resume in the same manner. I will then briefly continue. You live in a physical community, but you live first of all in a community of thoughts and feelings. These trigger your physical actions. They directly affect the behavior of your body. The experience of the animals is different, yet in their own ways animals have both individual intent and purpose. Their feelings are certainly as pertinent as yours. They dream, and in their way they reason. They do not worry. They do not anticipate disaster when no signs of it are apparent in their immediate environment. On their own, they do not need preventative medicine. Pet animals are inoculated against diseases, however, In your society, this almost becomes a necessity. In a purely natural setting, you would not have as many living puppies or kittens. There are stages of physical existence, and in those terms, nature knows what it is doing. When a species overproduces, the incidence of, say, epidemics grow. This applies to human populations as well as to the animals. The quality of life is important above all. Newborn animals either die quickly and naturally, painlessly, before their consciousnesses are fully focused here, or are killed by their mothers, not because they are weak or unfit to survive, but because the physical conditions are not those that will produce the quality of life that makes survival worthwhile. The consciousness that became so briefly physical is not annihilated, however, but in your terms, waits for better conditions. There are also trial runs in human and animal species alike, in which peaks are taken, are glimpses of physical life, and that is all. Epidemics sweeping through animal populations are also biological and psychic statements, then, in which each individual knows that only its own greatest fulfillment can satisfy the quality of life on an individual basis, and thus contribute to the mass survival of the species. Suffering is not necessarily good for the soul at all, and left alone, natural creatures do not seek it. There is a natural compassion, a biological knowledge, so that the mother of an animal knows whether or not existing conditions will support the new offspring. Animals instinctively realize their relationship with the great forces of life. They will instinctively starve an offspring, while its consciousness is still unfocused, rather than send it loose under adverse conditions. In a natural state, many children would die stillborn for the same reason, or would be naturally aborted. There is a give and take between all elements of nature, so that such individuals often choose mothers, for example, who perhaps wanted the experience of pregnancy but not of birth, where they chose the experience of the fetus but not necessarily that of the child. Often in such cases as these are fragment personalities wanting to taste physical reality but not being ready to deal with it. Each case is individual, however, so these are general statements. Many children who it seems should have died of disease of childhood epidemics nevertheless survive because of their different intents. The world of thought and feeling may be invisible, and yet it activates all physical systems with which you are acquainted. Animals as well as men can indeed make social statements that appear in a biological context. Animals stricken by kitten and puppy diseases, for example, choose to die, pointing out the fact that the quality of their lives individually and in mass is vastly lacking. Their relationship with their own species is no longer in balance. They cannot use their full abilities or powers, nor are many of them given compensating elements in terms of a beneficial psychic relationship with man, but instead are shunted aside, unwanted and unloved. An unloved animal does not want to live. Love involves self-respect and the trust in individual biological zest and integrity. To that extent, in their way, animal epidemics have the same causes as human ones. An animal can indeed commit suicide, so can a race or a species. The dignity of a spirited life demands that a certain quality of experience be maintained. End of dictation, end of session. My heartiest regards. Trust the changes in Rupert's own condition. A fond good evening. The same to you, Seth. Good night. Notes, Session 802. In ordinary terms, various kinds of plague, including the bubonic and the infamous Black Death, were and still are spread to man by fleas carrying a bacterium from infected rats. Other forms of the affliction are carried by other rodents. In Seth's terms, through the complicated interactions and communications involving all forms of life, man's deep dissatisfactions would have periodic ally helped trigger the resurgence of scourges like the plagues. In 3rd century Rome, for instance, several thousand people were said to have died each day. Estimates are that over a 20-year period in the 14th century, 3/4 of the population of Europe and Asia perished. There was the Great Plague of London in 1665 and so forth. Occasionally, instead of calling for a particular word or phrase to be underlined for emphasis, Seth delivers it louder, sometimes much louder. I often underline such material so the reader will know just what's been stressed. On the printed page, the results look pretty much like those words Seth himself wants underlined, but during the session they come through quite differently. Jane has great energy and power at her disposal when speaking for Seth, and I can often feel those qualities as though they form a collective, palpable entity in itself. During our private and book sessions, Seth's voice effects are usually quite conversational in tone and emphasis, and he speaks slowly enough so that I can comfortably take notes. The Seth voice can be stunning in volume and rapidity of delivery, however, and can seemingly continue in those modes indefinitely. I witnessed some truly remarkable demonstrations lasting several hours. Such manifestations are practically never carried that far in our regular sessions, however, nor is Jane ever exhausted by speaking for Seth. Rather, she reports an infusion of energy, both subjectively and objectively. As she often said, she rides the Seth voice or the energy behind or within it. Now I'm going to skip back down to where Seth, maybe this is important. Again, many can thankfully praise a given doctor for discovering a disease condition in time so that effective countering measures were taken and the disease was eliminated. You cannot know for sure, of course, what would have happened otherwise to those people who wanted to die. If they did not die of the disease, they may have fallen prey to an accident or died in a war or in a natural disaster. They may have been cured, whether or not they had treatment, and gone on to lead productive lives. You do not know. A man or woman who is ready to die, if saved from one disease, will promptly get another, or find a way of fulfilling that desire. Your problem there rests with the will to live and with the mechanisms of the psyche. Still, Jane and I do have our cats inoculated against feline distemper and respiratory viruses. Pets acquired at humane societies, as ours often are, have already shared an infected environment. We suppose that if we had young children we'd see to their receiving the immunizations they should have or are required to have by a school board, for example. It's very difficult in our society to rely upon beliefs alone where other people are involved, particularly in the face of medical and scientific propaganda. Let me add, though, that there are available today numerous vaccines against childhood diseases, but that many parents ignore many of them. Some of these vaccines for whooping cough, mumps, measles, German measles, or rubella, for instance, are still quite controversial. They're often only partially effective and can cause a variety of side effects. Reactions ranging from the temporary to the permanent or fatal. Jane and I strongly recommend that parents thoroughly investigate and understand the pros and the cons involved with each inoculation their children will receive. An English naturalist, Charles Darwin, maintained in his theory of organic evolution that all plants and animals develop from their own previous forms by inheriting minute variations through succeeding generations, with those forms best fitted to the environment being the ones most likely to survive. Amazingly, another English naturalist, Alfred Wallace, independently developed a similar theory, and the two men had their work presented to science in the same paper in 1858. The next year, Darwin published on the origin of species. I'm sure Seth would say that the whole affair was hardly a coincidence, since he's commented several times that new ideas often separately arise more than once in a given historical period. Okay, the next session. Ever since she began dictating mass events for Seth, Jane has felt like having book sessions but once a week on Monday nights and doing other things in between. So she's been working on her own, James, writing poetry, painting, and helping me out with Seth's psyche by doing some of the work I usually do when he's finished a book, typing sessions for the manuscript, checking my rough notes, rewriting some of them, and making suggestions about others. But with all of this, she's been refreshing her physical and creative selves by simply enjoying the day-to-day magical ripening of another spring. Now the session. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. Dictation. Your scientists are beginning to understand man's physical relationship with nature. The species is obviously a part of nature and not apart from it. Environmental questions are being raised about man's effect upon the world in which he lives. There is, however, an inner environment that connects all consciousnesses that dwell upon your planet, in whatever form. The mental or psychic, or in any case non-physical environment, is ever in a state of flux and motion. That activity provides you with all exterior phenomena. Give us a moment. Your sense perception, physically speaking, is a result of behavior on the part of organs that seem to you to have no reality outside of their relationship with you. Those organs are themselves composed of atoms and molecules with their own consciousness. They have then their own states of sensation and cognition. They work for you, allowing you to perceive physical reality. Your ears certainly seem to be permanent appendages, and so do your eyes. You say, my eyes are blue, or my ears are small. The physical matter of these sense organs changes constantly, however, with you none the wiser. While your body appears quite dependable, solid, and steady, you are not aware of the constant interchanges that occur between it and the physical environment. It does not bother you one whit that the physical substance of your body is made up of completely different atoms and molecules than it was composed of 7 years ago, say, or that your familiar hands are actually innocent of any smallest smidgen of matter that composed them, even in recent times past. You perceive your body as solid. Again, the very senses that made such a deduction are the result of the behavior of atoms and molecules, literally coming together to form the organs, filling a pattern of flesh. All other objects that you perceive are formed in their own way in the same fashion. The physical world that you recognize is made up of invisible patterns. These patterns are plastic in that while they exist, their final form is a matter of probabilities, directed by consciousness. Your senses perceive these patterns in their own ways. The patterns themselves can be activated in innumerable fashions. There is something out there, humorously emphatic, there is something out there to observe. Your sense apparatus determines what form that something will take, however. The mass whirl rises up before your eyes, but your eyes are part of that mass whirl. You cannot see your thoughts, so you do not realize that they have shape and form, even as, say, clouds do. There are currents of thought as there are currents of air, and the mental patterns of men's feelings and thoughts rise up like flames from a fire, or steam from hot water, to fall like ashes or like rain. All elements of the interior invisible environment work together, and they form the temporal weather patterns that are exteriorized mental states, presenting you locally and in mass then with a physical version of man's emotional states, period. As he had during the 801st session, our cat Billy roused himself from a snooze and walked over to Jane. This time he jumped up into her lap, then positioned himself with his forelegs against her chest while examining her face. Jane, as Seth, petted him. I called Billy to me. He perched briefly on my own lap, then curled up on the cushion beside me. Amused, you can say that I petted the pussy. Now, the physical planet is obviously also ever-changing. While it is operationally or realistically or pragmatically relatively stable, the physical matter of the planet is also composed of literally infinite hordes of consciousnesses, each experiencing its own reality while adding to the overall cooperative venture. Natural disasters represent an understandably prejudiced concept in which the vast, creative, and rejuvenating elements important to planetary life, and therefore to mankind, are ignored. The stability of the planet rests upon such changes and alterations, even as a body's stability is dependent upon, say, the birth and death of the cells. It is quite obvious that people must die, not only because otherwise you would overpopulate your world into extinction, but because the nature of consciousness requires new experiences, challenges, and accomplishments. This is everywhere apparent in nature itself. If there were no death, you would have to invent it, for the context of that selfhood would be as limited as the experience of a great sculptor given but one hunk of stone. The sculpture's creation is pragmatically realistic in that it exists as an object and can be quite legitimately perceived, as can your world. The sculpture's statue, however, comes from the inner environment, the patterns of probabilities. These patterns are not themselves inactive. They are possessed by the desire to be actualized. Behind all realities there are mental states. These always seek form, though again, there are other forms than those that you recognize. A chair is a chair for your purposes. As Rupert speaks for me, he sits in one. As you read this book, you probably lounge on a chair or couch or bench, all quite sturdy and real. The atoms and molecules within those chairs and couches are quite alert, though you do not grant them the quality of life. When children play Ring Around the Rosie, they form living circles in the air. In that game, they enjoy the motion of their bodies, but they do not identify with those swirling circles. The atoms and molecules that make up a chair play a different kind of Ring Around the Rosie and are involved in constant motion, forming a certain pattern that you perceive as a chair. The difference in motion are so divergent that to you the chair, like your body, appears permanent. The atoms and molecules, like the children, enjoy their motion, solidly sketched in space from your perspective, however, with no idea that you consider that motion a chair, or so use it. It's solidly sketched in space from your perspective, however, with no idea that you consider that motion a chair, or so use it. You perceive the atom's activity in that fashion. Nevertheless, the agreement takes place at mental levels and is never completely set, though it appears to be. No one perceives the same chair all of the time, though perhaps a given chair will seem to be the same one seen from different angles. The dance of the atoms and the molecules is continuous in your area. In greater terms, even any given chair is never the same chair. All of this must be taken into consideration when we discuss mass events. Take your break.